What's up, guys? Well, you have finally made it to the final week of e-learning. So with that, no new assignments will be posted after this week. You'll have until June 5th or 7th, I believe, possibly the 10th. I will double check and post it on my page. But you have until June to turn in any assignments that aren't completed in any of your classes. But as of following this week, there will be no new assignments posted. So we are wrapping up and finishing up with the last little bit of what we would have been covering in class had we have still been in there. And that is Reconstruction, taking you to the end of American History 1. And so today's little video lecture right here is the final part of Reconstruction, part 2. All right, so let's go ahead and let's get started. Who made up Reconstruction? All right, we know that the radical Republicans in the federal government made up a good chunk of the Reconstruction group that took place, but they can only do so much. They only make law. Who are the people that are going to be the hands and feet down in the South that are actually going to be bringing about this change? So before we jump in right into how Reconstruction started to fail, first let us take a look at who made up Reconstruction outside of the federal government. And what do I mean by this? I mean, Southerners who just fought against the Union weren't going to willy-nilly forget about everything and be like, oh, let me help. Some might have wanted to change the business dynamics. We'll get to that more later on in this lecture. But the social dynamics they did not want to change, right? The change would have come from Northerners coming south. And these Northerners that came south, they got a nickname applied to them by Southerners called carpetbaggers. And this was not a good term. Now, why did Northerners who were called carpetbaggers come south? Well, they came for an acronym that I call POWS: power, opportunity, wealth, and to serve. Right? They wanted power in the government. Right? Again, with Southerners losing the Civil War, these individual state governments were coming back in. But until President Johnson issued that general amnesty, a lot of those politicians could not serve in their own state legislatures. So there were open vacant seats. Well, what better way than for a Northerner to come down south and occupy that seat to help bring about change? Therefore, they gained power. There was also opportunities for a chance to make wealth, which ties in the next one. Say if you were some poor person in Ohio, there is an opportunity now to make wealth or gain power in the South. So you leave Ohio where you couldn't get a head start at, and you come down south. And a lot of the times, the motives of these people coming south for opportunity, power, or wealth were not good motives. They were there to use the South, which we'll get more to that here in a second. And then the final little bit of it is service, right? Teachers, doctors, lawyers that were coming down to help the newly freed people of the South. Right. So the Republican coalition in the South looked like this. There was one, the carpetbaggers, Northerners who came south for power, opportunity, wealth, and service. It also consisted of freedmen and women, and then scallywags. And scallywags was another derogatory term used to Southerners who left the Democratic Party to become Republicans to help bring about changes that the radical Republican Congress in Washington, D.C. was attempting to bring about. So these three groups of people made up the Republican coalition, the hands and feet in the South. Now, resistance to change. I ask in class, and I kind of take a pause, and I ask you guys in class, like, do you like change? Right? I mean, and sometimes one or two kids will raise their hands. Yeah, I like change. But for the most part, most people would say, no, I don't like change. Well, take that mindset and now envision you were a Southerner in 1866, 67, 68, right, post-war. Never before in a Southerner's life had they had to deal with 4+ million people now being freed all at once. Plus, the whole economic system of the South and that lifestyle that comes with it was done away with. They had the federal government put their states under military rule. And so now you felt if you were a common Southerner, you didn't have a say. You were being controlled by a federal government. They felt like they were being force-fed change that they didn't want from the radical Republicans. So for some Southern Democrats, there was no choice left, and that was to resist. They knew that they couldn't win in the ballot box, not quite yet because of the military command in the Southern governments. So they resorted to violence, and the Ku Klux Klan was born. It was started by a Tennessean by the name of Nathan Bedford Forrest. The first Klan would use intimidation, violence, and even murder to keep blacks and white Republicans from voting and pressing the needs for certain issues. This will be the case all the way up until the 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement. Reconstruction starts to fall apart. In 1872, Grant won the presidential election. He vowed to support the radical Republican platforms. However, as I mentioned before in the video lecture before, scandal after scandal rocked his presidency. The Teapot Dome scandal, the Whiskey Ring. Now, these were national scandals. And even more so, there was scandals that were happening in the individual southern states from carpetbaggers coming down, and these southern governments and the that were being run by Republicans from the north. Corruption just kept leaking and oozing out. And so that's why I typed also things in the South weren't going to plan. Northern carpetbaggers that went down there for wealth took advantage of the South, made their millions, and then left the South in a terrible position. The people living there. Change wasn't going to plan, and no matter if the military was there, they couldn't keep their eyes on everything. The KKK would go into counties that held a Republican majority and attempted to suppress the votes of people. And if there's one thing that people understand is fear and intimidation is a powerful tool. If you know that you could possibly have your life taken from you or the lives of loved ones taken away from you because of violence that's being brought about by how you vote or how you think, well, then you're going to be locked up inside your house, not going out. Fear and intimidation is a powerful tool. Plus, let's not forget about President Johnson's general amnesty order that he issued. Well, by 1874, some of those Southern politicians that would have never been able to serve in state and federal legislation again now start to regain their seats. Since they were pardoned of all of their crimes and their records were cleared and they had a clean slate, they could now start rejoining state legislatures and the federal legislation as well too, which now numbers start to change. Okay. 1874, Reconstruction is on life support. Pardon me. Northern public opinion started to turn against the radical Republican Reconstruction plan. There was a perception of colored rule that started to be spread all throughout the North by Democratic candidates who were attempting to take Republican seats. They would tell the people that the Republicans don't care about you if you are poor, don't have a job, and can't make a living. All they care about is making sure the black man gets all of that, not you. The facts were really easy to point out, too, due to a lot of the corrupt carpetbagger governments in the South and people using the South. And so even the Northern public opinion started to change about the radical Republican Reconstruction plan. And in the 1874 midterm congressional elections, the Democrats took a majority of seats in the U.S. House of Representatives. Due to the factors that we just talked about, which is corruption taking place in the South and the Reconstruction policies, but also there was a really bad economy. And so now, while the Senate is still held by the radical Republicans, the U.S. House of Reps swings completely to the Democratic side. And so what we see now is the Democrats have control of the House of Representatives, which they can roadblock any piece of legislation from here on out that is attempting to help African Americans in the South. Okay, they can stop it dead in its tracks. All right, and not only that, now they can start to institute their own policies as well in the state and federal government. Home rule is coming home. In one of the questions from the last video, I asked you to explain what you thought home rule meant. Some of you got it right, some of you were really close, but basically it is the return back to the way things were before the war, just without slavery. All right. By 1869, Union military governments were handing the reins back over to local governments in states such as Virginia and Tennessee. By 1870, North Carolina had been given back to the North Carolinians. By 1873, Texas was handed back over. And basically, it didn't mean that the military was completely leaving these states. It's just that the military was no longer forcing the rules, making sure that these rules coming from Congress, the radical Republicans in Congress prior to 1874, that these rules, they were there to make sure that the rules were being enforced. Well, the military was still there by 1869, Tennessee and Virginia, by 1870, North Carolina, 1873, Texas. The military was still there, but they weren't forcing the rules. They just kind of stood there and were bystanders in case something big popped off. But other than forcing these pieces of legislation, they just stepped aside and let Southern bourbon aristocrats retake their seats and reestablish this home rule. Right, so the South was moving back to the way it was before, just without slavery, and state legislatures dominated by Southern Democrats. But again, just one thing: slavery wasn't allowed, which we'll get to what they're going to do in an attempt to try to make sure that they still can keep their authority and power over the people of the South. All right, the Compromise of 1877, Reconstruction's final end. With Republicans reeling after the loss of Congress in 1874, the presidential election of 1876 became huge for Republicans. President Grant would step aside after 2 terms. Remember, the amendment for presidential term limits isn't in existence. The 22nd Amendment will put a presidential term limit in place, but that's not in existence. But Grant probably couldn't have won the election even if he wanted to, due to the corruption taking place in his presidency. The Republicans go ahead and nominate a moderate from Ohio. His name is Rutherford B. Hayes, and he was really sympathetic to the South. The Democrats go ahead and nominate Samuel J. Tilden, the governor of New York. Initially, Tilden had the lead in both the popular and the electoral vote. 3 states, though, had contested elections: South Carolina, Florida, that's nothing new, and Louisiana. All right. In a secret negotiation with members from the state electoral boards of these 3 states, Hayes agreed that he would remove the federal occupation in these 3 states if they swung their votes his way. In what became known as the Compromise of 1877, South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida would give their electoral votes to Hayes, and he would win the election 185 to 184 over Tilden. As promised, Hayes would then end the federal occupation of those states, and home rule was quickly reestablished. With the compromise, Reconstruction had officially ended, and the South became known as the Solid South. Right. With the federal occupation officially over in 1877, Redeemer governments asserted themselves in the southern states. The South would be known as the Solid South, a Democratic stronghold. The Republican Party would be a non-entity in the South all the way until the late 1960s. And in class, I would literally show you electoral map after electoral map, and literally the rest of the country, pardon me, the rest of the country would be blue or red, Democrat or Republican, but the South, the entirety of what was once the Confederacy, would all be the same color. You'd have, northern states and western states that would be, red, blue, red, blue, red, blue. But the South would remain blue. It would remain Democrat. It would just stay that way all the way up until the late 1960s, even into the 1970s. They would remain the Solid South. And that's what the term Solid South means, is that they did not vote for any Republican person. You might have 1 or 2 few exceptions here or there in individual states, but for the most part, if you look at the presidential maps, they voted Democrat all the way. All right. Reconstruction Aftermath, the New South. In an article posted in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution by the editor, Henry W. Grady, he termed the idea of this New South, right? Since slavery was no more, the South needed to leave its agricultural roots and move to a more manufacturing like the North. While there was some growth in manufacturing in the South, such as iron in Alabama, if any of you are big football fans, you know that the big football game between Alabama and Auburn is called the Iron Bowl. It used to take place in Birmingham, Alabama, the second largest leading iron steel producer in America, behind Pittsburgh, hence why their football team is called the Steelers. Right? The second largest iron and steel producing town in America was in Birmingham, Alabama. Right, hence why they call it the Iron Bowl that those 2 teams play in. And like I said, they used to play the game in Birmingham. Now they just played at their respective campuses, but it used to take place at a neutral site in Birmingham, which is known as the South's iron capital. And so iron took over in Alabama. Here in North Carolina, textile mills shot up. The cannon factory in Kannapolis sprung up, in Concord Mills in that area right there. However, despite this idea of trying to get the South to become like the North and become a manufacturing hub, most of the South would still stay with agriculture. And still to this very day, a lot of the South, if you drive to like eastern North Carolina, you're not going to find much manufacturing taking place there. The eastern part of our state is still heavily, heavily agriculture, right? So the term New South, though, would take on a different meaning. Since slavery was outlawed, how could the white bourbon elite class still have control? Simple. The new form of slavery in the South would be debt and fear. All right. So this new way of controlling people would be via debt and would be via fear. For many former slaves, what to do with this new freedom was a tough question. With no money, they couldn't leave the South. With little education, they couldn't rise through the ranks in industry or anything new. So they went back to what they knew how to do, and that was farm. They became known as sharecroppers or tenant farmers. The plantation owners who owned that land now needed a way to make money. So what they would do is that they would rent pieces of their land out to most of the time, their former slaves. They would rent it out to them and allow them to farm. But the problem is that they would give the seed, they'd give the tools, they'd give the equipment to these people, and these people had no money to begin with, so they had to take a loan out. They had to go into debt to borrow the equipment, to borrow the seed, to borrow fertilizer and pesticides and things like that. And so because they had no money, they had to take a loan out. Well, the people that owned the banks happened to also be the former plantation owners. So basically, they went in debt, and they could never get out of debt. They didn't make enough money from their crops. I believe it was in 1871, 72, there was a very big drought, and the crops that came out were not in the numbers that were needed. So therefore, you couldn't pay your bills, you couldn't pay your loan back. And so what happened a lot of the times was that these former plantation owners that owned the land, that gave it out to the people, right, to share crop and tenant farm on, they would just take the land away from them. Think of it like an apartment. You sign a lease, and you're supposed to make a payment. If you don't make your payment, you get kicked out of your apartment. Same thing happened to a lot of African Americans in the South that were sharecroppers and tenant farmers. They couldn't make the payments, and so they got kicked off the land, and they just became kind of like vagabonds. They just kind of traveled around. They bounced from place to place, and still having to make payments back to the people that own the land. So they could never really get a step forward. And hence why I put on this slide on the bottom part right here, the new form of slavery in the South would be debt and fear. And so that debt became very, very prominent in the South, right? If being economically oppressed wasn't bad enough, a new wave of oppression socially arose in the South, and it would be in the form of these three things. All right, Jim Crow. Jim Crow, simply we know it as segregation, would take place. In many Southern states, they would issue these things called black codes, which would put social restrictions on blacks, such as what you could do to buy a business and start a business, marrying, dating, what times you could go out and about. So first of all, they're going to put you in economic oppression via sharecropping and tenant farming, put you into debt so that you can never get out of debt. Right. Then they were going to put social restrictions on you, segregation being Jim Crow, and then they put these codes on top of it that said you could do this, but you couldn't do this. You could do this, but you couldn't do this. And then in the voting area, they would put a grandfather clause in place in the South. A grandfather clause basically stated if your grandfather could vote, you could vote. If your grandfather couldn't vote, then you can't vote, which, let's think about it. Most of the former slaves who are now free, right, their grandfathers or their grandparents were slaves. They couldn't vote at all. So hence they couldn't vote. If you passed that grandfather clause, then they put what was known as the poll tax in place. You had to pay to go vote, which there will be a constitutional amendment that will come into play, right, that you'll learn about in American history too, that will basically do away with the poll taxes. But if you pass the grandfather clause, then you had to pay a poll tax. All right, you had to pay money to vote, which today you can't even comprehend thinking you have to pay to vote. That's one of your God-given rights is to vote. And one of the most important things in our democracy to do is to vote. All right, but they would put that poll tax. Now, if you could pass the grandfather clause and you could pay the money for the poll tax, then they'd hit you with a literacy test. Can you read and can you write? If you couldn't do that, then you couldn't vote. So basically, all three of these things were put into place, and they were methods used in the South to keep blacks from voting. So economically, they kept them in debt. Right. Then they set social oppression restrictions in order, such as Jim Crow, black codes, grandfather clause, poll taxes, and literacy tests. Basically put, going back to the way it was before, the only thing about it is that they're not quote unquote slaves anymore, since the 13th Amendment was passed and the southern states could not do anything against that. All right, now the Supreme Court would uphold Jim Crow laws as well as voting restrictions all the way up until the 1960s. Guys, this is 1870. So 1880, 1890, 1900, 1910, 1920, 1930, 1940, 1950, 1960. We're talking about, 90 plus years, almost 100 years after the Civil War, the final shots of the Civil War, and all of these acts were put into place. The Supreme Court would uphold every one of these Jim Crow, black codes, grandfather clause, poll taxes. And they would say, because since voting laws did not explicitly discriminate based on race. Well, yes, they did. Well, Southerners would turn around and say, no, whites can't do it either. If their grandfather couldn't vote, they couldn't vote. White people, if they couldn't pay the poll tax, they couldn't vote. And a lot of Southern white people could not read, all right, or write. So guess what? They couldn't vote as well too. And so they would turn around to the Supreme Court and to lawyers and tell them, hey, we're not just doing this just to African Americans, we're doing this to whites as well too. So really what we saw established was this white bourbon rich elite class that was in rule prior to the Civil War. Well, once these redeemer governments start coming back, they remain in power in the South. It will be a power controlled by the few, dictating to the many. Right? And then segregation would be upheld in the landmark Supreme Court case Plessy v. Ferguson, which quotes the term separate but equal. As long as the facilities are equal, then you can be separated. But the reality was all across the South that the facilities were nowhere near equal, but no one challenged it, right? Not until the Civil Rights Movement. So Reconstruction aftermath. After over 600,000 deaths, a president being assassinated, 3 presidents, military occupation, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments being passed, the many successes of Reconstruction, initially like the Freedmen's Bureau, the South went back to the way it was before. It would remain this way until the Civil Rights Movement began in the 1960s to bring about change to all of these things. And still to this very day, there are issues in 2020 we are battling over due to the failure of Reconstruction. Again, 600,000 men lost their lives fighting for a higher cause. And while the 13th Amendment was passed and it abolished slavery once and for all, still the other issues that came with it still persisted all the way until federal legislation started to change that in the 1960s. And even today, guys, we still battle with the issues that our forefathers were battling with in the 1870s, in the 1880s. The issues that they fought over are the issues we fight over today, maybe just in a little different manner, but they're the same issues. Because of Reconstruction's failure, we still are fighting over these same issues. So that's why Reconstruction is a very important time, and it's very prevalent even today in American history. Its failure pushed back the needle of progress for close to 100 years. And so, with that, there's a lot of issues that didn't get solved. And so that's the final little bit, the final lecture of the class. I really appreciate you guys sticking with it and doing the assignments and, staying up to date on that. It's probably not been the easiest thing. It's not been easy for any of us teachers as well either. But I truly greatly appreciate it. I look forward to talking to you guys next school year, whatever that might look like. But, I'm pretty sure we'll be back. So again, thank you. And I'll talk to you guys later.